Thus began the darkest and most luminous Thursday that Jerusalem has ever known. In that precise year when heaven and earth reached a point of maximum tension, when a man who was also God gathered 12 fishermen, tax collectors, and dreamers around a table, and the world was never the same again. The year is 33 AD. The city is Jerusalem. And what you are about to walk through is not just history, it is the very heart of the gospel beating in real time, hour by hour, gesture by gesture, word by word, on the most sacred Thursday humanity has ever lived. To understand what happened that day, you must first understand the city that contained it. Jerusalem in 33 AD was not a city at rest, it was a city in a state of eruption. During Passover week, its usual population of approximately 80,000 inhabitants multiplied dramatically with pilgrims arriving from Galilee, from the Decapolis, from Egypt, from Babylon, and even from Rome itself. All were converging upon the hills of Judea to fulfill the commandment of Exodus, to celebrate the Passover in the place the Lord had chosen. Estimates based on temple sacrifice records suggest that during those days, between 100,000 and 250,000 people could be found in the city and its surroundings. The narrow streets of the upper city and the lower city were filled to overflowing. The markets operated without pause. The priests worked in exhausting shifts. The smoke from the sacrifices ascended continuously from the temple courtyard, visible from miles away, mixing with the aroma of bitter herbs, unleavened bread, and spiced wine that floated over every home in the city. It was in this context of crowds, religious fervor, collective memory, and messianic expectation that Jesus of Nazareth moved with a calmness that was disconcerting to those who observed him. He knew what no one else knew yet, that this Thursday was not simply another celebration of Passover. It was the Passover. It was the moment toward which all previous lambs had pointed. It was the night when the shadow would become reality, when the symbol would yield its place to the body and blood of the true Lamb. It was the night that the promise made to Abraham, renewed to Moses, sung by David, and announced by Isaiah, would reach its definitive and unrepeatable fulfillment. To accurately place what occurred that Thursday, it is necessary to understand how the Jewish world of the first century measured time. The day did not begin at dawn, as in the Roman tradition we have inherited. The Hebrew day began at sunset with the appearance of the first stars. This means that Passover Thursday, as lived by Jesus and his disciples, actually began at sunset on Wednesday. And it was in those first hours of darkness, in the transition between the fourth and fifth day of the week, where the events of the Last Supper unfolded. This distinction is not a minor detail. It is the key that explains why the Passover lamb was sacrificed in the afternoon before nightfall and consumed during the night, and why the celebration Jesus shared with his disciples fulfilled with surgical precision every requirement established in Exodus 12. The Lord did not improvise, the Lord fulfilled. The preparation for Passover began days before, but the Thursday in question had its own ritual demands starting from the morning. Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree that it was during that day when the disciples approached Jesus and asked him where he wanted them to prepare the Passover meal. Jesus' response was, as so many other times, both practical and mysterious. He told them to enter the city and that there they would find a man carrying a jar of water, to follow him and tell the owner of the house that the teacher asked where the guest room was, where he could eat the Passover with his disciples. In the cultural context of first-century Jerusalem, this detail of the man with the water jar is extraordinarily revealing. Carrying water was a task performed by women, not men. A man carrying a water jar was so unusual that it functioned as an unmistakable signal in the middle of the crowd. Jesus was using a code that only his messengers would understand. Peter and John were commissioned for this mission. According to Luke's account, they had to buy the lamb, take it to the temple for sacrifice, collect the blood in a vessel that the priest would sprinkle upon the altar, and then cook the animal roasted over charcoal embers, following the precise instructions of Exodus. They also had to acquire the bitter herbs, the unleavened bread, and the wine, and prepare the mixture of fruits, nuts, and spices known as charoset, which represented the mortar that the Hebrew slaves had used in Egypt. None of this was fast or simple. The preparation of a full Passover meal was a labor of hours that required coordination, ritual knowledge, and access to the correct supplies. And all of this had to be completed before sunset, when the new day began and the dinner could be served. The place where all this occurred is known in Christian tradition as the cenacle, from the Latin conaculum, which simply means a dining room on the upper floor. The Greek of the New Testament uses the term anagaion, which describes exactly that, a large room on the upper level of a house. Archaeology and patristic tradition place this location on Mount Zion, in the southwestern part of the ancient city, in an area that during the Second Temple period was inhabited by upper-middle-class families and some of the most prestigious priestly families. The room described in the Gospels was large enough to house 13 people reclining in the usual position of a Greco-Roman banquet, with the diners leaning on their left side around a low U-shaped or horseshoe-shaped table. This spatial arrangement, which the Romans called a triclinium, had been widely adopted in Palestine during the Hellenistic period, and was the standard way in which wealthy Jewish families celebrated Passover. They were not sitting on chairs in the style of medieval paintings. They were reclining like free men, because that was one of the symbolic requirements of Passover, to dine as people who are no longer slaves. When Jesus arrived with his disciples at the cenacle as evening fell, the atmosphere was that of an extended family gathered for the most sacred moment of the Jewish religious calendar. But there was a tension floating beneath the surface of the preparations. The disciples had been arguing about who was the greatest among them, a conversation that Luke places precisely in the context of this same meal, which speaks to how deeply they had not yet understood the nature of the kingdom that Jesus had come to establish. There was also among them one who had already made his decision. Judas Iscariot carried with him the weight of an agreement made with the chief priests, 30 pieces of silver that weighed infinitely more in his bag than they had weighed in his hand. And there was Jesus himself, who, according to the Gospel of John, knew all the things that were to happen to him, and yet he sat at the table with them. He looked them in the eyes, one by one, and began the meal. John's account introduces the first act of Holy Thursday with a scene that has shaken the conscience of the Church from the first century until today. Before the meal began, Jesus rose, laid aside his outer garment, took a towel and tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel. The verse introducing this scene is one of the most theologically dense in the New Testament. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper. John 13, 3-4. The evangelist wants the reader to understand something fundamental. This is not the gesture of someone who does not know who he is. This is the gesture of someone who knows perfectly who he is, and precisely for that reason he kneels. Omnipotence bows. Glory girds itself with a towel. The one who held the worlds took the dust-covered feet of his disciples and washed them with his own hands. In first-century culture, washing feet was the task of the lowest-ranking slave in the house. It was so low in the domestic hierarchy that rabbinic literature of that period indicates even a Jewish disciple should not wash his master's feet, as the task was too humiliating even for that relationship. And here was the Son of God doing exactly that for each of them. When he came to Peter, the shock was too much for him. "Lord, are you washing my feet?" John 13:6. Peter's resistance was not arrogance, it was the inability to integrate into his understanding of the world that the Messiah could do such a thing. But Jesus answered him with one of those phrases that seem simple on the surface, but have abysses of depth beneath. "What I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this." John 13:7. And then he added something that explained everything, though they could not yet fully grasp it. "If I do not wash you, you have no part with me." John 13:8. The cleansing Jesus offered with water that night was a figure of the cleansing he would offer with his blood the next day. The washing of the feet was the pedagogical lesson preceding the classroom of Calvary. When he finished washing their feet and put his garment back on, Jesus explained the meaning of what he had done with a clarity that left no room for confusion. "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet." On that Thursday night, the church received not just a symbol, but a structural model of what Christian leadership means. Power exercised as service, authority clothed in humility, greatness measured in kenosis, in voluntary emptying. 2,000 years of church history have struggled with that lesson, forgotten it, rediscovered it, betrayed it, and embraced it again, because it is a lesson that goes against every instinct of the human ego. Yet there it is, engraved in the heart of Holy Thursday like a flame that never goes out. The meal itself followed the order of the Passover Seder as it was practiced in the Second Temple era. We must pause here to understand the structure of this ritual, for without that understanding, it is impossible to appreciate the magnitude of what Jesus was doing. The Passover Seder was not simply a dinner, it was a liturgy of active memory, an event where the participant did not remember the past as something distant, but relived it as the present. The ritual questions the youngest son would ask the father, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" were not a matter of historical curiosity, they were the gateway to a narrative that transformed the participant. "I was a slave in Egypt. I was set free by the outstretched arm of the Lord. I ate the bread of affliction. I crossed the sea." In first-century Jewish thought, Passover made the original redemption present and anticipated it in the future. It was memory, identity, and hope in a single ritual. This Seder followed a sequence of 4 cups of wine, each with its specific meaning, taken from Exodus 6:6-7, where God promises Israel 4 redemptive actions: "I will bring out, I will deliver, I will redeem, I will take." The first cup, called the Cup of Sanctification, opened the celebration with a blessing over the wine and a declaration of the day's holiness. This was followed by a portion of bitter herbs dipped in salt water or vinegar, recalling the tears of captivity. Then came the narration of the Haggadah, the story of the Exodus, with its questions and answers, its songs and explanations. The second cup, the cup of proclamation or of the plagues, was drunk at the end of this narrative, followed by the first part of the Hallel, Psalms 113 and 114, sung as a hymn of gratitude. Then came the main meal, the Passover lamb, the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, and the charoset. After the meal, the third cup, called the Cup of Redemption or Cup of Blessing, sealed the banquet with thanksgiving, and the fourth cup, the Cup of Consummation, closed the liturgy along with the second part of the Hallel, Psalms 115 through 118, and the Great Hallel, Psalm 136. It is in the context of this precise liturgy, weighted with centuries of tradition, that Jesus took the unleavened bread in his hands during the moment after the meal and said something that no Seder celebrant had ever said before. Luke records it this way, "And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, 'This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me.'" Luke 22:19. And then, in an equally solemn manner, and also without precedent in the entire history of Jewish liturgy, he took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you." Luke 22:20. In that moment, with those two phrases, Jesus was doing something of unparalleled theological audacity. He was reinterpreting the entire Exodus in terms of himself. He was saying that he was the lamb to which all previous lambs had pointed. He was saying that his body was the true bread, the definitive manna. He was saying that his blood would inaugurate the new covenant that Jeremiah had prophesied in chapter 31. The covenant written not on stone tablets, but on the human heart. And he was instituting a rite that his followers would repeat until his return, a way of proclaiming his death and announcing his coming every time they broke the bread and drank the cup. Paul picks up this tradition in 1 Corinthians with a formula that New Testament scholars recognize as one of the oldest texts in the Christian canon, transmitted as a liturgical tradition even before the Gospels were written. "For I received from the Lord that which I also delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it, and said, 'Take, eat, this is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same manner he also took the cup after supper, saying, 'This cup is the new covenant in my blood. This do, as often as you drink it, in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes." Every time the church gathers around the Lord's table, it is back in that cenacle. Every breaking of the bread is an echo of those hands that took the matzah and broke it with a gravity the disciples could not yet fully understand. Every cup is a reflection of that cup Jesus took and over which he pronounced words that changed the history of the world. It was also during that same meal that Jesus spoke the most disturbing revelation of the night, one that chilled the atmosphere in the cenacle with a starkness that none of those present would ever forget. John 13:21 records it with a brief and devastating sentence. Jesus was troubled in spirit and declared, "Most assuredly I say to you, one of you will betray me." The consternation was immediate. The disciples began to look at one another, not knowing of whom he spoke. Peter signaled to John, who was reclining next to Jesus in the place of honor, to ask him who it was. John, with an intimacy that only the physical closeness of that triclinium arrangement made possible, leaned back against Jesus' chest and whispered, "Lord, who is it?" John 13:25. Jesus' answer was also given in code, a gesture from the ancient banquet culture that carried a precise meaning. "It is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I have dipped it." John 13:26. And he took a piece of bread, dipped it in the dish, and gave it to Judas Iscariot. In the banquet protocol of the ancient Near East, offering the dipped morsel to someone was a gesture of honor, an act of affection from the host toward a special guest. Until the very last moment, Jesus was offering Judas not just the unmasking of his betrayal, but the possibility of return. And Judas took the bread and went out. And it was night. John 13:30. That very brief phrase with which John closes Judas's departure is one of the most heavily weighted with theological meaning in the entire New Testament. It was night. The evangelist is not simply giving a meteorological fact. In John's theology, the night is the domain of those who choose to walk away from the light. Judas walked out into the only kind of night that matters. He stepped away from the presence of the light of the world toward the darkness he had chosen. And what is even more disturbing when one thinks about this slowly is that the other disciples did not understand what had happened. They thought Jesus had told him to go buy something for the feast or to give something to the poor. The betrayal occurred right before their eyes, and they misinterpreted it as a domestic errand. That is how close evil can be to what we love, and how blind we can be to it. It was after Judas's departure that Jesus delivered the longest and most intimate discourse recorded in any of the Gospels, the farewell discourse, which occupies chapters 13 to 17 of John and includes the high priestly prayer of chapter 17, recognized since antiquity as the deepest prayer text in the New Testament. It is in this discourse that Jesus told them about the mansions he was going to prepare for them, where he affirmed himself to be the way, the truth, and the life, where he promised the Holy Spirit as the Comforter and Paraclete, where he commanded them to love one another as he had loved them, where he warned them that the world would hate them, and where he assured them that although in the world they would have tribulation, he had overcome the world. He said all of this that night in that cenacle, while the time he had left grew shorter, speaking with the urgency of someone who knows that every word could be the last they hear from his lips in circumstances of freedom. The prayer in chapter 17 deserves a special pause, because it is one of the most astonishing texts in all of Scripture. Jesus lifted his eyes to heaven and began to pray, and what came from his lips was a conversation between the Son and the Father that the disciples heard as witnesses to something occurring between two persons of the Trinity. "Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son also may glorify you." John 17:1. And further on in the verse that has been called the heart of the chapter, "And this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." John 17:3. And in what is perhaps the most intimate and universal moment at the same time, "I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word." John 17:20. In that moment, in that cenacle, on that Holy Thursday 20 centuries ago, Jesus was praying for you personally, not as an abstraction, not as a theological category, but as the specific person you are in the specific time you live, with the specific faith you have placed in him through the unbroken chain of witnesses that began that night. I want you to stop here for a moment and truly feel it. Jesus, on his last night of freedom, in the hours preceding the deepest suffering a human being can imagine, chose to invest his final energies in praying for those who had not yet been born, for those who would believe centuries later, for those who would read about him in languages that did not yet exist, on continents that had not yet been discovered. You were in that prayer. That is the extent of the love that sat at the table in the cenacle that night. While the Lord prayed and taught, the city of Jerusalem continued its Passover life around him. In the outer courtyard of the temple, torches lit the last sacrifices of the day. In the cobblestone streets of the upper city, pilgrims sang fragments of the Hallel as they returned to their lodgings after their own Passover meals. The temple guards made their habitual rounds. The Roman soldiers of the Praetorium garrison watched the city from the walls with the attention of those who know that religious crowds are unpredictable. And in a corner of the city, in a place the Gospels do not name, but which must have been close enough to the temple for transactions to be made quickly, Judas Iscariot was speaking with the emissaries of the chief priests, coordinating the final details of what would happen that very night. The meal concluded with the Hallel, just as the Passover liturgy prescribed. Matthew and Mark mention it with a brevity that hides the magnitude of what they were describing. And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives, Matthew 26:30. The hymn was almost certainly the second part of the Hallel, Psalms 115 to 118. Imagine for a moment the sound of that chanting in the cenacle. 13 voices, some already broken by emotion, lifting up in Aramaic the words of Psalm 118, including this verse that must have resonated in a special way at that moment. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, Psalm 118:22. And then this other one, this is the day the Lord has made. We will rejoice and be glad in it, Psalm 118:24. Jesus sang that psalm knowing that the next day he would be that rejected stone. He sang that psalm knowing that the next day would be the day the Lord had made, the day that would change the calendar of eternity. And he sang because perfect obedience included praising the Father, even on the eve of the altar. When they left the cenacle, the night of Jerusalem enveloped them. They descended through the streets of the upper city, crossed the Kidron Valley by the bridge or stone path that existed in that sector, and began to climb the western slope of the Mount of Olives toward a place that Luke calls simply the Mount of Olives, and that Matthew and Mark identify more specifically by the name Gethsemane, an Aramaic word meaning oil press. On the slope of the Mount of Olives, olive groves abounded, and it was perfectly common for there to be facilities for oil production in that area. This was not a place Jesus was visiting for the first time. The Gospel of John specifies that Jesus had often gone there with his disciples, John 18:2. It was a place he knew, a place he had surely used before for prayer, a place with a certain topographical intimacy for that group. And for that very reason, it was also a place that Judas knew, and where he knew he would find them. What happened in Gethsemane is one of the most disconcerting and profound episodes of the Gospels, one that the Church has meditated upon for 2,000 years without exhausting its depth. Jesus separated Peter, James, and John from the rest of the group, led them deeper into the garden, and asked them to stay awake while he went to pray. Then, according to Matthew, he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. He said to the 3 disciples, "My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." Matthew 26:38. Luke adds a detail that medicine has studied and discussed for centuries, that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down to the ground. The phenomenon Luke describes, known in medical literature as hematidrosis, is clinically recognized as possible in situations of extreme physiological stress, when the capillaries surrounding the sweat glands rupture under pressure and mix blood with sweat. Luke, whom New Testament scholars recognize as a physician, was describing what he saw with the eyes of someone trained in clinical observation. The martyrs of Israel had died with serene determination, and Jesus knew this. What weighed upon him in Gethsemane was something infinitely more vast, the anticipation of carrying the totality of human sin, of being made a curse for us, of experiencing the separation from the Father that sin produces, of drinking the cup of God's holy wrath against everything that destroys the creation and the humanity he loved. And under that weight, from the ground of the garden, with the damp earth of the spring night beneath his knees, Jesus prayed, "O my Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Matthew 26:39. In that prayer is contained the entire theology of salvation. It is the prayer of the perfect Son who, in his humanity, trembles at what is to come, but who, in his perfect obedience, surrenders without reserve to the Father's will. It is the ante-Eden. Where Adam said no to God to follow his own will, the second Adam said yes to God, even when his humanity trembled at the price. 3 times Jesus went to pray, and 3 times he found the disciples asleep, the very ones he had asked to watch. He did not rebuke them with severity. With a mixture of understanding and melancholy, he said to Peter, the one who had promised to die with him rather than deny him, "The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Matthew 26:41. There is a tenderness in that phrase that is deeply moving. Jesus did not idealize his disciples. He knew them. He knew what they were made of, and he loved them anyway. Between that first prayer and the arrival of Judas with the temple guards, Luke specifies that an angel came to Jesus and strengthened him. Heaven was not absent from Gethsemane. Heaven was watching, participating in its own way, sustaining the one who sustained the world while the world slept. The arrival of Judas at the garden put an end to the night of prayer. He arrived with a large crowd, armed with swords and clubs, sent by the chief priests and elders, carrying torches and weapons, ready to carry out an arrest that the organizers wanted to be as discreet as possible, away from the eyes of the crowds who might react unpredictably. Judas had given them a prearranged signal. It would be the one he approached and greeted with a kiss, the habitual greeting of respect between disciples and teachers in the first-century Jewish world. And so he did. He approached Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus' response was once again disconcerting in its gentleness. "Friend, why have you come?" Friend. In the moment of ultimate betrayal, Jesus called the traitor friend. It was at that moment that a brief but enormously significant episode occurred. Peter, impulsive as always, drew a sword and cut off the right ear of one of the high priest's servants, whose name John preserves for history, Malchus. Jesus' response was immediate. "Put your sword in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. Or do you think that I cannot now pray to my Father, and he will provide me with more than 12 legions of angels?" A Roman legion consisted of approximately 6,000 soldiers. 12 legions would be 72,000 beings of a nature completely different from any human force. And the Lord did not call them. He chose not to call them. And then, in a gesture of mercy that Luke alone records, he touched Malchus's ear and healed him. The last miracle of healing Jesus performed before his crucifixion was to repair the damage caused by one of his own disciples upon a man who had come to arrest him. The gospel is sometimes so extraordinarily consistent with itself that it is dazzling. The disciples fled. Mark preserves a cryptic detail that many interpreters have taken as the autobiographical mark of Mark himself, the mention of a young man who followed him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They seized him, but he left the linen cloth and fled naked. Whoever that young man was, what matters is what he represents: the final abandonment. Every last follower fled into the darkness, and Jesus remained alone with his captors. Holy Thursday did not end because things spiraled out of control. It ended because things finally reached their destination. I want to ask you something from the heart, and I want you to take it to the most honest place within you. Have you ever had a moment where you felt God was praying for you, that heaven was sustaining you in the midst of something that felt too big for your own strength? Tell me in the comments. I want to read it, because that is exactly what Holy Thursday tells you today. It's not dead history, it's a living, active reality. When the bread is broken in your church, you are in the cenacle. When you pray in your darkest moments, you are in Gethsemane with the one who also prayed in the dark and was heard. The one who bowed to wash feet will return. The one who broke the bread will return. The one who prayed for you in John 17 will return. And when he returns, The Thursday that began that night in the cenacle will find its consummation in the banquet that will have no end. You now carry in your heart the most sacred Thursday in history. Do not keep it only for yourself. There is someone in your life who needs to hear that on that night, Jesus also prayed for them. Share this video with that person. Be the messenger the cenacle needs in the 21st century. And if you are not yet part of this community, subscribe today, because every week we continue to walk through the truths that sustain the faith with the same depth, the same passion, and the same broken bread.